One second I was standing at the altar in a rented tuxedo, and the next I was being escorted out of my own wedding by two men in black suits while 200 guests watched in silence. All because I talked back to my stepmother at the rehearsal dinner the night before. That's the part people never believe when I tell them. Not the part about the $400 million, not the part about the lawyer who walked in right as security reached the door. They never believe that the whole thing started because I told her the centerpieces looked wrong. My name is Ethan Marsh, and I'm 31 years old. I've been an engineer for 6 years. I paid my own way through college, bought my own car, and for the last 4 years I had been engaged to a woman named Claire, who I thought was the love of my life. I say thought because of what happened on the morning of June 14th at the Whitmore Grand Hotel in downtown Chicago, in a ballroom that my stepmother had spent 11 months and $80,000 planning. I should back up. My father, Raymond Marsh, died when I was 9 years old. He was a quiet man who built things, not in a poetic sense, literally. He started a construction and real estate development company called Marsh Group in the late 1980s, and by the time I was born, it had become one of the more respected mid-sized developers in the Midwest. He never talked about money at home. He coached my little league team. He made pancakes on Saturday mornings. He was the kind of father you don't fully appreciate until he's gone, and then you spend the rest of your life appreciating him too late. When he died of a heart attack, I was in 3rd grade. I didn't understand what any of it meant. The company, the assets, the estate. I just knew my father wasn't coming home. My mother had passed 2 years before that from cancer. So after Raymond died, I went to live with his sister, my Aunt Patricia, in Indianapolis. She was a retired schoolteacher. She was kind and patient, and she did her best, but she had no connection to my father's business world. None of us did. 3 years after my father died, I found out he had remarried. Her name was Diane. She had come into his life about 18 months before he passed, and they had a small private ceremony that Raymond apparently never told anyone about, including me, including his sister. The first time I heard Diane's name was when a different lawyer called my aunt's house looking for documentation related to the estate. I was 12. I remember sitting on the stairs listening to my aunt's voice change on the phone. By the time I was old enough to ask real questions, I was told that Diane had been named executor of the estate and that she had taken over management of Marsh Group. My aunt had hired a lawyer of her own, a man named Gerald who charged $200 an hour and accomplished very little, who told us that the marriage was legally documented and that Diane's control of the company was airtight. There had been a will, Gerald said, but it had been superseded by a later document. He showed us the paperwork. Everything appeared to be in order. I grew up believing that my father's company belonged to Diane. I grew up believing that whatever he had built was no longer connected to me. I didn't like it, but I had no way to fight it, and so I put my head down and built my own life instead. I got into engineering. I was good at it. I liked solving problems that had correct answers. I moved to Chicago at 24 for a job at a structural firm, and I stayed because I loved the city. I met Claire at a friend's birthday party. We dated for 2 years before I proposed. She said yes before I finished the sentence. Diane had, over the years, remained on the periphery of my life in the way that something you've lost stays on the periphery. You're always aware of it without ever fully looking at it. She had grown Marsh Group significantly, or more accurately, she had hired people who grew it. She had remarried as well, to a man named Douglas Holt, who was 20 years younger than her and who had the particular kind of confidence that comes from never having earned anything. They had a son together, Marcus, who was 24 and who had been installed as the vice president of Marsh Group's residential division, despite having no background in construction or real estate. When I got engaged, I sent Diane a brief email. I'm not entirely sure why. Some obligation to family, I suppose, or some lingering hope that things could be civil. She responded warmly, more warmly than I expected, and said she would love to attend the wedding. She said she had always felt terrible about how complicated things had been and that she hoped this could be a new beginning. I believed her. That was my mistake. Over the following year, Diane inserted herself into the wedding planning with the kind of enthusiasm that seemed generous at first. She offered to cover the venue. She offered to handle the catering. One offer led to another until she had essentially organized the entire event. And Claire, who got along with Diane far better than I did, thought it was wonderful. I had a feeling I couldn't quite name, something in my stomach that I kept dismissing as stress. The rehearsal dinner was the night before the wedding, at a private room in the same hotel. 60 people. Open bar. Everything looked perfect except for the table centerpieces, which were supposed to be white and ivory arrangements but had come out almost entirely cream and gold. I mentioned it quietly to Diane as guests were arriving. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even particularly bothered. I said something like, I think there might have been a mix-up with the flowers. They look more gold than white. That was it. That was the whole thing. Diane's face changed in a way I had never seen before, and I have thought about that look many times since. It wasn't embarrassment. It wasn't frustration. It was something colder than both of those. She smiled at me and said, very quietly, "Why don't you just be grateful someone is doing this for you?" Then she turned and walked away to greet another guest. I didn't sleep that night. The morning of the wedding, I was in the groom's suite on the 4th floor with my best man, a college friend named Joel, getting dressed and trying to keep my hands steady. Joel kept telling me it was nerves. I kept thinking it was something else. At 10:45 a.m., 15 minutes before the ceremony was supposed to begin, there was a knock on the door. 2 men in dark suits introduced themselves as hotel security. They told me that a formal complaint had been filed against me by the event organizer, Diane, citing threatening and aggressive behavior at last night's event. They said they were required to remove me from the premises until the matter could be reviewed. One of them actually put his hand on my arm. Joel stepped in front of them. I told him it was fine. I don't know why I said it was fine. I was so stunned that some part of my brain decided that compliance was the only available option. I remember walking down the corridor and thinking that this couldn't be real, that I would reach the lobby and someone would explain that there had been a mistake. The lobby was worse. Somehow word had traveled. Guests who had already been seated were standing near the ballroom entrance. I saw Claire's mother. I saw my college roommate. I saw the face of every person I had ever wanted to respect me arranged in a kind of horrified audience. Diane was standing near the front desk with Douglas beside her, and she looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as satisfied. Security walked me toward the exit. The revolving door was 10 feet away. That was when I heard someone call my name. Not Joel. Not Claire. A voice I didn't recognize, even professional, unhurried. Mr. Marsh. Ethan Marsh. I turned around. A man in his late 50s was walking across the lobby toward me. He was wearing a charcoal gray suit and carrying a leather document case. He had the kind of posture that belongs to people who have delivered important news for a living, completely calm, completely certain of what he was doing there. "My name is Robert Calloway," he said when he reached me. "I'm an attorney with Calloway and Associates. I have been retained for the past 22 years to execute a time-conditional provision in the estate of Raymond Allen Marsh." He paused and looked directly at me. "Your father, I believe." The security guard beside me actually took a small step back. I said, "What does time-conditional mean?" Robert Calloway opened his document case. "It means your father anticipated that certain parties might take steps to prevent this document from reaching you prematurely. He specified that it was not to be disclosed until you turned 31 years old and had documented employment of at least 3 years, conditions which, as of February of this year, you have satisfied." He held out a sealed envelope. He also specified that if any attempt was made to remove you from a significant life event before this document was delivered, we were to treat that as an acceleration trigger and deliver it immediately. He glanced briefly at the 2 security guards. "I received the call 40 minutes ago. My hands were not steady when I took the envelope. I'm going to tell you what was in it. My father, Raymond Marsh, had not superseded his original will. The document that Diane had presented to the court after his death, the one that named her executor and gave her control of Marsh Group, had been a forgery. My father had known in the months before he died that his heart condition was serious. He had worked with Robert Calloway to create a secondary estate structure, a trust called the Marsh Legacy Provision, that held 74% controlling interest in Marsh Group, plus all associated real estate assets in my name. The trust was designed to be invisible until I turned 31. It could not be dissolved, sold, or transferred by anyone other than me. The reason Diane had control was that she had control of the operating company, the day-to-day entity. But the trust had always held the underlying ownership. Every building, every contract, every piece of land that Marsh Group had developed in the last 22 years had been building equity in a structure that belonged to me. Total estimated value, $418 million. I stood in the lobby of the Whitmore Grand Hotel and read that number 3 times. Then I looked up and saw Diane watching me from across the room. I don't know what she saw in my face. Whatever it was, it made her take a step toward Douglas. Robert Calloway spoke before I could say anything. He turned to the security guards with a patience that I found extraordinary, given the circumstances. Gentlemen, I'd like to clarify the legal situation here. The person you've been asked to remove is, as of this morning, the majority owner of a trust that holds controlling interest in Marsh Group Holdings. The woman who filed the complaint against him. He nodded toward Diane, has been operating that company under a fraudulent instrument of authority for 22 years. I have already been in contact with the Cook County District Attorney's Office. If you would like to continue escorting Mr. Marsh out of this building, you are welcome to do so, but I'd encourage you to speak with your manager first. The taller security guard looked at the shorter security guard. Neither of them moved. Joel had somehow materialized at my shoulder. He was holding my boutonniere. I have no idea why he was holding my boutonniere. Diane walked toward us then, and I have to give her credit. She walked toward us. Douglas stayed where he was. She stopped about 6 feet away and looked at the document in my hands and then looked at Robert Calloway. That document is not valid, she said. Her voice was even. We went through probate. Everything was settled. Everything that was submitted to probate was settled, Robert said. The Marsh legacy provision was never submitted to probate because it existed outside the estate in a discretionary trust structure. It did not require probate approval. I'd be happy to have my office walk your attorneys through the details, though I suspect they'll reach the same conclusion rather quickly. This is harassment, Diane said. She said it to me, not to Robert. As though the lawyer standing next to me was somehow my invention. You've always resented me. You've spent your entire adult life, Diane. I surprised myself with how calm I sounded. I don't resent you. I don't feel anything about you right now. I feel something about my father, and about the company he built, and about the fact that my fiancé is sitting in that ballroom waiting for me while 2 men you hired are standing next to me. I looked at the security guards. Are we done here? They stepped aside. What happened over the next 4 hours was one of the stranger experiences of my life, and I have had a strange life. Claire came out of the ballroom when Joel sent her a text. I met her in the corridor outside the main hall and showed her the document. She read it twice. Then she looked at me for a long moment and said, "Are we still getting married today?" I said, "I would really like to get married today." We got married at 12:15 p.m., 45 minutes late. It was the best 45 minutes of delay I have ever experienced. Robert Calloway and 2 associates sat in the back row. Diane and Douglas had left the hotel by the time we came out for the reception. The legal process that followed was not fast and it was not simple, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The forgery case was significant. My father's original signature had been replicated on the superseding will document using a technique that forensic analysts described as sophisticated but not undetectable by modern methods. Diane's personal attorney was disbarred. Douglas, it turned out, had known everything. He had helped structure the cover-up in exchange for access to Diane's share of the operating revenues. The district attorney's office filed charges on 7 counts. Marcus, for what it's worth, had genuinely not known. I met with him once, at Robert's office, about 3 months after the wedding. He was 24 and he looked like someone had pulled the floor out from under him, which in fairness they had. I told him that I had no intention of going after him personally, that whatever role he had played was a function of what he'd been told, and that if he wanted to build a legitimate career in real estate development, I would not stand in his way. He didn't say much. He looked like his mother's son in that moment, and I felt sorry for him. The board of Marsh Group, the operating company, voted unanimously to recognize the trust's controlling interest within 6 weeks of the documents being filed. Robert told me this was faster than expected. I think the board members had their own unanswered questions about how certain decisions had been made over the years, and the emergence of a legitimate principle gave everyone a clean direction to move. I didn't take over the company in any operational sense. I'm an engineer, not an executive. What I did was install a new CEO, a woman named Sandra Okafor, who had spent 15 years building mid-sized commercial developers in the Southeast and who came recommended by 3 people in the industry I respected. I joined the board. I reviewed the portfolio. My father had been a good builder. The bones of everything he started were solid. Some of what Diane had done with the company was actually competent, which is the part I have had to make peace with. She had taken something real and grown it, even if she had taken it illegally. The land, the contracts, the relationships were worth inheriting. Sandra agreed. I went back to my engineering job for another 8 months while the transition stabilized. Claire and I moved into a larger apartment. We talked a lot about what we wanted the rest of our lives to look like now that the landscape had changed so dramatically. She had her own career. She's a physician's assistant, and she was clear that she didn't want to become someone who just lived adjacent to money. I loved her more for saying that. There's one more thing I want to tell you, because it's the part that still gets to me when I think about it late at night. About 2 months after the wedding, while Robert's team was deep in the document review, they found a letter. It had been filed with the trust documents in 1998, when I was 5 years old. My father had written it by hand, and it was addressed to me. It was 3 paragraphs long. I'm not going to read all of it to you, but I'll tell you what the last part said. He wrote that he didn't know exactly what situation would bring the trust to light, but that he suspected it would not be a peaceful one. He wrote that he was sorry he couldn't be there to hand it to me himself, and then he wrote, "Whatever they told you about what I left behind, the truth is I left it all to you. I always meant for it to be yours. I just needed to make sure you were ready to carry it." I read that letter sitting on the floor of Robert's conference room with the door closed. I was 31 years old and I cried like I was 9 again. My father was a quiet man who built things. It turns out he had been building something for me all along. Not just the company, not just the assets, but the structure of a truth that was designed to survive whatever tried to bury it. I think about that sometimes when I'm solving a hard problem at work. The answer was always there. You just had to wait for the right conditions to see it. If you've been listening to this, if any part of it sounds familiar, if you've ever felt like something that should have been yours was taken before you were old enough to fight for it, I want you to know that my father's instinct was right. The truth has a way of holding its shape, even when everything around it is pressure and noise. Thank you for being here with me for this one.